Well, hello, I am Frank Zafiro, and if you are looking at this, it's because it's Wednesday. That means Hump Day readings. This week I'm going to be reading the very beginning of my novel At Their Own Game, which was published in 2014. It is a standalone set in Spokane, Washington, about a former police officer who turns to a life of property crime. The book is available on audiobook, and it is narrated by Peter Husmann, who does a stellar job. I won't do it justice, but then again, you are getting the author's rating, so there's that. I'm getting old accoutrements here. I did dedicate this book to Gail, my mom, and the epigram is, "We are what we repeatedly do." And that was Aristotle who said that. Chapter 1. So far, I've been to jail 3 different ways. The first way was when I was on the job, working as a cop. Back then, I'd walk right through the officer entrance with my handcuffed prisoner in tow. I'd stop in the outer waiting area and secure my weapon in the gun lockers, drop the oversized key ring into my empty holster, and walk the bad guy straight into the booking area. The second way I went to jail wasn't much different, except that time I was the one in handcuffs. As a prisoner, I had no weapon to secure. All my stuff was already in a plastic bag carried by the arresting officer. And I found booking to be a whole different experience on that trip. Tonight was the third way, through the visitor entrance. The woman at the reception desk wore a uniform shirt that was too big for her. The shoulder seam hung at least an inch past her elbow. Past her actual shoulder. The short sleeves went well past her elbow. The fit made her bony arms stick out of the sleeves like toothpicks. Her red hair clearly came from a bottle. Even so, it was splotched with gray. All of that, and a sour expression, too. "Visiting hours end in 15 minutes, she said without glancing at the clock. She had the gravelly voice of a smoker, although probably not quite as much like Marge Simpson's sisters as I just did. "Then I'm just in time," I said. "Takes 10 minutes to process you through." I didn't answer. "So you're pretty much too late," she added. I stared at her. She stared back. I didn't bother smiling. This was not a woman that would be swayed with a smile, especially not if she recognized me. Instead, I said, "Well, seeing as how I'm here in time, and seeing how I'm the personal representative of Matt Emerson, I guess you'll have to process me through, and then I'll talk to the floor sergeant about the time issue." She stared at me some more. Then she asked, "You're a lawyer?" "I represent Mr. Emerson," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Why didn't you use the lawyer entrance?" I fixed her with a darker stare. "Are you supposed to check me in or interrogate me?" She blinked and thought about it for a moment. Finally, she just shrugged. "Don't blame me if the Sarge gives you the boot." She held out her hand. "Identification?" "Aren't you supposed to say please?" "Listen, smart guy, you want in? Give me the goddamn ID." Then I'd smiled. I'd won. And if I decided to file a complaint against her for poor demeanor, it might not be sustained, but it would be a black mark on her file just the same. Sometimes I wished I had time for that kind of sport. I removed my driver's license and handed it over. She glanced at it, started to glance away, then did a double take at the name. Recognition flooded across her face. She looked up at me, scowling. "Jacob Stankovich. I know who you are. You're not a lawyer." "I never said I was." "Yes, you did." "No, I didn't." "Don't lie," she said. "You absolutely told me that you were the prisoner's lawyer." I shook my head. "No, I said I represent him. I never said I was a lawyer." She stared at me, playing the conversation back in her head. Her memory must have been decent, because she eventually realized I was right. She frowned at me. "You implied it," she muttered. I shrugged. "Anyway, if you're not his lawyer, then you're just a visitor. And visiting hours, State v. McKenna, I said. Her brow furrowed. Huh? State v. McKenna, I repeated. A Ninth Circuit case from 8 years ago. It plainly states that if a defendant elects to be pro se, he is allowed to name anyone he desires as personal representative in lieu of a public defender. That representative is afforded the same considerations, including access to the defendant, as his defense attorney would be. She shook her head slowly. I've never heard of that, I shrugged. I'm not surprised. Training has always been for shit at the jail. Her eyes narrowed. Maybe you're making it up. I was done jousting for tonight. I leaned in and said, maybe you should Google it. But meanwhile, you better put me through, or I'll have you up on demeanor charges before dinner and federal civil rights violations by dessert. Her cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth to reply, then closed it. Instead, she turned to the computer and angrily tapped a few keys. When she handed me back my ID card, her lips were set in a hard line. Through the door when I buzz it. Follow the blue line. And that is how our adventure with Jacob Stankovich begins. He's going to see one of his 2 henchmen who got picked up on a warrant, and things start to go sideways for him pretty quick. This was an interesting book for me because I took the character of the bad guy, and usually I've written about cops, albeit sometimes cops who have screwed up or are doing bad things. This guy's totally on the other side of the law. But you know, he was a cop, so I guess it wasn't a huge stretch for me. I was actually inspired by the fact that there always have been people who have said that, at least back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, that there were cops who were pretty much, if they hadn't gone with the cops and arrested people, then they'd be the people we'd be arresting. They had a fork in the road. They could have gone one way or the other. They chose law enforcement as opposed to crime. I think it's a bit of an urban legend to a degree, although I guess I knew a couple of guys that I could have seen that in. But I thought, what would happen if this did occur? Somebody who was a cop got bounced off the job. Would their insider information help them be a smarter criminal, and could they beat the cops at their own game? Anyway, that is Hump Day Reading. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please hit like, and don't forget to subscribe so you get the updates every week when they come in. And I will see you next Wednesday.